Just one coffee. The rain had just started to fall in quiet, hesitant drops over Los Angeles, the kind of rain that makes everything shimmer like it's been polished with memory. Inside a tucked-away bookstore cafe in West Hollywood, the door swung open, and a gust of cool air swept in, along with a man whose name didn't need to be spoken. Keanu Reeves didn't rush through life, and today was no exception. He paused just long enough at the threshold for the barista to glance up, unsure whether the man who walked in was real or just another actor look-alike. But then Keanu nodded gently, a small respectful smile on his face, and stepped inside as if the rain had personally invited him. He wasn't dressed like Hollywood royalty. A black turtleneck, a slightly weathered gray coat, and boots that looked like they'd seen both snow and silence. And in his hand, a paperback copy of Letters to a Young Poet. Not for style. He actually read it. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the cafe sat Sandra Bullock, curled into the oversized armchair by the frosted window. Her coat was still damp around the collar, and a nearly empty cup of herbal tea rested on the little table beside her. Forgotten. She had no makeup on, just her. A woman lost in thought, rereading a message on her phone that hadn't changed in hours. Her smile was faint but sad, like someone trying to look forward while still carrying a little too much from behind. She didn't notice him at first, not until the sound of his voice drifted softly to her from the counter, ordering a coffee with a kindness that made the barista blush. She looked up then, eyes locking onto the back of a man she hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. Keanu turned as if he felt her gaze before she even spoke, and when his eyes found hers, the noise of the cafe dimmed, like the universe took a step back to let something old and unspoken rise again. He tilted his head, the beginnings of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sandra?" he asked, walking slowly toward her. "Didn't expect to find you here of all places." She stood up, brushing hair from her face in that same nervous way she always had when she wasn't prepared for something real. "Keanu, it's been, 2 years since we promised each other coffee?" He laughed, that warm, disarming chuckle that made people trust him without knowing why. "More like 20, he said. "But who's counting?" She gestured to the chair across from her, and he took it like a man returning to a conversation that had simply been paused by time. They talked at first like old friends, dancing over safe topics. Films they didn't do, people they used to know, things they missed about simpler times. But as the coffee cooled between them, something deeper started to bloom. Sandra stared out the window for a long moment before saying, "I think I've forgotten how to sit with someone and just be." Keanu didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, hands clasped loosely, elbows on the table. Maybe that's why we ran into each other today. To remember. And just like that, it wasn't a date, and yet it was. It wasn't a reconnection, but something softer and quieter, like a note passed between two souls who didn't need the noise of romance to remember they mattered. Sandra admitted how she'd been quietly grieving, not for anyone in particular, but for time itself. For the roles she said yes to when her heart said no. For the nights she wanted to call someone and realized she didn't know who that someone was anymore. For how success didn't feel like success when it came at the cost of her stillness. Keanu, never the man to rush anyone through their honesty, listened. Not with the kind of fake interest that actors are sometimes good at mimicking, but with a stillness that made Sandra's voice crack halfway through her confession. "I've been lonely," she whispered, suddenly embarrassed by her own vulnerability. Not in the dramatic way, not even in the sad way. Just quietly. A little more every year. Keanu looked at her then. Not with pity, but with understanding carved from his own scars. You're not alone in feeling that way. The silence doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you've been listening too long to a world that never shuts up. She stared at him for a moment and felt something strange. She wanted to cry, but not because she was sad, because someone finally said exactly what she had felt for so long. The rain outside had become steady now, tapping softly against the glass like it was trying to write a poem of its own. People came and went, some recognizing them but choosing not to interrupt. Maybe it was the way they looked at each other. Not with sparks or flirtation, but something rarer. Mutual recognition. The kind that only happens between two people who've walked through fire and come out quieter, not louder. As dusk settled in, Keanu asked, "Do you want to walk for a bit?" Sandra nodded, slipping on her coat. They walked side by side, umbrellas forgotten, the rain soaking through their shoulders and sleeves. But neither of them cared. As they wandered through the tree-lined sidewalks of West Hollywood, they spoke about regrets like old war stories. Keanu shared about losing people, how grief doesn't come in waves but in echoes. "Sometimes," he said, "I wake up and remember something so small about someone I've lost, like the way they laughed at the end of a bad joke. And that's what breaks me. Not the funeral, not the goodbye, just that laugh." Sandra reached over and touched his hand, not to comfort but to say, "Me too," without words. By the time they reached the small parking lot behind the cafe, neither of them was ready to say goodbye. But they also didn't need to plan what came next. They stood under the awning of an old art studio, water dripping steadily from its edge, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Then Keanu said, "Maybe it's not about coffee. Maybe it's about finally keeping a promise we made to ourselves." Sandra tilted her head. "What promise?" He smiled softly. "To show up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we don't know how the story ends." And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the city lights reflected in her tired but hopeful eyes, Sandra knew something had shifted. Not in the Hollywood way, not in the way tabloids write headlines, but in the way people begin again, not with declarations or grand gestures, but with presence, with truth, with one cup of coffee, 20 years too late and yet, somehow, right on time. She wasn't acting. The next morning didn't begin with a text or a call. There were no plans made the night before. No, "Let's meet again tomorrow," or "I'll call you later." Just the unspoken weight of something unfinished, something fragile and too sacred to rush. Sandra Bullock sat at her kitchen table, barefoot, in one of those old UCLA sweatshirts she wore when she didn't need to be Sandra Bullock. She sipped lukewarm coffee she'd forgotten to finish twice already, but her mind wasn't on the coffee. It was on him, on the way he listened, on the way he didn't try to fix her pain but simply stood beside it. It had been so long since someone did that, since someone made her feel like she didn't have to perform strength to be seen. She looked at her phone, thumb hovering over the contacts, then put it down again. There was no script for what she felt. It wasn't love yet, not in the way magazines romanticize, but it was something deeper, something real and quiet and rare, like the kind of friendship that doesn't need anything in return but space to breathe. Keanu, on the other side of the city, sat on a bench outside an old vinyl record shop, a place he visited when the world felt too fast. He had an unopened coffee beside him and a motorcycle helmet resting on his knee. The city moved around him in its usual blur, but he wasn't part of that motion today. He was thinking about her, not in the nostalgic way people remember old flames, but in the way people remember who they used to be when someone finally let them feel without shame. He thought about how she admitted her quiet loneliness, how she didn't mask it with sarcasm or fake cheerfulness like so many did. It made him realize just how rare honesty had become, and how beautiful it was when someone allowed it to live in the open. He wasn't in love with Sandra Bullock, the actress. He wasn't even trying to fall in love. But something about her stillness, her truth, her gentle unraveling in the middle of that cafe, it stayed with him, not like a spark, more like a song stuck in your soul. That evening, the sun was setting over Malibu in long golden ribbons, the kind that makes everything look more forgiving. Sandra had driven without a destination, needing the ocean and the horizon to remind her that some endings didn't need closure, only breath. But as she sat there, windows down, hair tied up loosely, the sound of footsteps in the sand made her glance over. There he was, Keanu, in jeans and a charcoal t-shirt with a bag slung over his shoulder that clearly didn't belong to a man trying to impress anyone. No, he wasn't trying to be seen. He was just showing up, like he said he would. He didn't wave or call her name. He just walked toward the rocks beside her car and sat down, as if this had always been the plan. "Did you know," he began, watching the waves, "that the ocean doesn't actually stop moving, even when it looks still? Underneath, it's always alive, always shifting, Sandra turned her head, watching him more than the water now. "That's a little too poetic for a guy with chain grease on his jeans," she said, smiling, but the smile didn't hide the gratitude in her eyes. They sat there, both quiet, both not needing to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence that heals, the kind that only exists between people who trust each other enough to not speak. Eventually, she asked, "Why did you really come yesterday? Why now?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, breathed in the salty air, then said softly, "Because I've spent most of my life trying to be invisible, to grieve quietly, to hurt without making others uncomfortable. But I realized something. If we don't let people see us when we're lost, how will they ever know how to find us?" Sandra blinked, her hands folded in her lap, trembling slightly. She realized she wasn't acting anymore. Not the strong woman role. Not the celebrity mask. Not even the friend who always had it together. She was just herself. A woman who had loved deeply, lost often, and still chose to show up. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that if I just kept achieving, kept moving, I'd outrun the pain. But now, I think I've just been running from standing still." He looked at her then, his face soft, not pushing, not demanding anything. "Just present." "Then maybe it's time to stop," he said. "Just for tonight. Just for this moment. Let the world spin without us." And so they sat, as the sky turned from gold to gray and the tide crept closer. Neither one reached for the other's hand. Neither made promises they couldn't keep. But something unspoken passed between them. Something neither could name, but both could feel. Like a pulse under skin. Like a note played once but still echoing in the heart. As the stars blinked above and the world hushed itself into evening, Sandra turned toward him and whispered something she hadn't said out loud in years. "I miss being known." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then let's get to know each other again. Not the Hollywood way, the real way." And without another word they stood up, walked back to their cars, and left the beach behind. But not what happened there. That stayed in the sand, in the silence, in the gentle truth that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they once believed. More than just a face in the crowd. The invitation came on a rainy Thursday, the kind of gray, overcast afternoon that made Los Angeles feel more like a small European town than a sun-drenched celebrity hub. A charity gala. The kind both Sandra and Keanu had attended countless times over the years, always as ambassadors, presenters, or distant figures to be admired from across the ballroom. But this one was different, not because of the cause, though it was noble, or the guest list, though it sparkled with names, but because this time they were going together. Not as a couple, not as co-stars, but simply together. It was Sandra's idea, sent as a voice note, not a text. Her voice low and unsure, carrying a trace of vulnerability, like she was asking for more than just company. "I just thought it might be nice to not go alone, and I thought of you." That was all she said, and it was more than enough. Keanu showed up that evening in a dark suit that didn't scream designer, but whispered elegance. His hair was a little longer than usual, tied loosely at the nape, and there was something about the way he stood, not with the posture of a man performing for a room, but with the quiet assurance of someone who didn't need to be anyone but himself. Sandra met him at the steps of the art museum-turned-gala venue, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She wore a navy satin dress. Not loud, not showy, but breathtaking in how it made her look like someone who didn't need to be noticed to be unforgettable. "You look," Keanu began, then stopped, not because he couldn't find the words, but because none would have been enough. "So do you," she replied gently, eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize it before the night carried them into the crowd. Inside, the lights shimmered off marble columns and string quartets played softly in corners. People turned to glance, some recognizing them, some too shy to believe it. But Sandra and Keanu didn't walk in holding hands or posing for cameras. They moved side by side, two souls sharing a space quietly, like travelers who had agreed to walk the same path, not for show, not for headlines, but because something unspoken had begun to grow. As the evening unfolded, they mingled, talked, smiled when asked, but always found their way back to each other's side. Like gravity, like the soul's quiet pull, somewhere between conversations with philanthropists and shared glances during speeches, something happened. Sandra began to see him differently. Not just the Keanu she'd laughed with on old sets, or the man who carried the world like a quiet song, but the version of him others saw too. She noticed how the younger guests listened when he spoke, not because of who he was, but because of how he was. Present, real, kind in a world that rewarded noise. At one point, while she was getting water, a woman in her early 20s, a rising actress, all energy and nervous ambition, leaned in and whispered, "He's incredible, isn't he? Keanu, he really listens. Listens." And Sandra smiled, not because she agreed, but because she realized she'd almost forgotten how rare that was. That someone could be famous and still human, respected and still humble, desired and still completely uninterested in validation. She returned to their table, watching him from a distance for a moment. He was helping an elderly donor to her seat, not for show, not for applause, just because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, it hit her. She wasn't falling for an image. She was beginning to admire the man. Slowly, deeply, silently. Later, under the lights of the museum garden where the gala spilled out into crisp evening air, they found a quieter corner, away from the guests, away from the flash of cameras. Just two folding chairs near a sculpture no one was paying attention to. Sandra wrapped her arms around herself, more from habit than cold. "You know what's strange?" she asked, voice just above a whisper. "What?" Keanu turned slightly, his full attention on her like she was the only sound in the world. "Tonight, I realized something. I've spent years surrounded by thousands of people, fans, friends, colleagues, and I've never felt lonelier than I did in some of those crowds." She looked up at him, her eyes not teary but tired. "But tonight, sitting next to you, I felt seen, without having to be anyone." He didn't rush to fill the silence. He just nodded, then looked out over the garden. "I think that's what most of us want," he said. "To be known without explanation. To be loved without performance." They didn't kiss. They didn't hold each other under the stars. They just sat, side by side, two people with bruised hearts and hopeful souls, sharing the kind of connection that didn't need to be labeled. When it was time to go, Keanu walked her to her car. He didn't lean in, didn't linger, just smiled with a quiet intensity that said, "This matters to me." And Sandra, instead of driving away immediately, sat in her car for several minutes afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart louder than it had been in years. Not because she'd fallen in love, not yet, but because she'd finally remembered what it felt like to be cared for with no agenda. No timeline, no script, just presence, just truth. "Don't stay if you'll leave too," the rain had come back. Not the gentle kind that merely glossed the windows or whispered across rooftops. This time, it poured like a confession, relentless, as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding it all in. Sandra sat alone in her home, lights dim, a half-finished glass of red wine on the kitchen counter untouched. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the silence inside was heavier. It had been 3 days since the gala. 3 days since Keanu walked her to her car with nothing more than a goodbye that lingered in the air like an echo. 3 days since she had felt something stirring in a part of her soul she had spent years trying to forget even existed. But instead of calling him, she had buried herself in the illusion of busyness. Reading scripts she wasn't excited about, attending meetings she didn't believe in, scrolling through photos from a life that no longer felt like hers. Because the truth was cruel in its clarity. She was afraid. Not of Keanu, not of love, but of what came after someone finally saw her, the real her, and left anyway. She told herself stories, the way people do when they're afraid to hope. She told herself that maybe he was just being kind, that maybe the connection she felt was one-sided, that maybe, just maybe, it was safer to let this remain a sweet memory than risk watching it fade in real time. But even her lies felt paper-thin in the face of his silence. And then, just past 9 p.m., there was a knock at her door. Not urgent, not loud, Just steady. Sandra didn't move at first. Her heart stilled, then quickened like a bird trapped in a dark room. She stood slowly, walked barefoot across the wooden floor, and opened the door. There he was, rain-drenched, hair falling over his forehead, his dark coat soaked through. But his eyes, they were calm, steady, familiar in a way that made her breath hitch. "You weren't going to call me, were you?" Keanu asked, not with accusation, but with a quiet knowing that stripped her of all pretense. She opened the door wider, stepped aside without a word, and he entered, dripping rainwater onto her rug like a man who'd come from somewhere far more difficult than a storm. They sat across from each other in her small reading room, where a single lamp threw shadows across the shelves of worn books and photographs that hadn't been moved in years. For a while, they didn't speak, just sat, two people tangled in the weight of unsaid things. Finally, Sandra broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to let someone in without waiting for them to disappear." Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He didn't flinch. "I'm not here to fix you, Sandra. I'm here to stand with you." That's it. No promises. No pretending. She looked down at her hands, twisting the ring on her finger she didn't remember putting on. "Every man I've let close to me," she said slowly, "left with pieces I never got back. I don't have a version of love that didn't ask me to shrink." Keanu's voice was soft, but unshakable. "Then let's not call it love. Not yet. Let's call it presence. Let's call it showing up. I don't need you to be whole. I just need you to be real." Her throat tightened, because no one had ever said that to her. Not in all her years of red carpets, late-night interviews, or perfectly timed smiles. No one had ever asked her to stay broken, to be unfinished, to be human. And somehow, that invitation was more terrifying than any grand declaration. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked. "What if I can't be what you think I am?" Keanu's eyes never left hers. "Then you'll be exactly what I hoped you'd be. Honest." The tears came without warning, not loud, not dramatic, just slow, quiet grief escaping through the cracks. Grief for the girl she used to be. Grief for the years she spent pretending. Grief for how long it had taken to be seen. And still Keanu didn't move to fix it. Didn't reach for her. He let her cry. Let her shatter. Let her be exactly what she needed to be in that moment. And somehow, that was the most loving thing he could have done. When she finally looked up, eyes wet, breath shaky, she asked, "Why are you really here, Keanu?" He leaned back, his voice barely a thread. "Because I've been searching for something still. Something true. And that night in the cafe, when you looked at me without expectation, without performance, I felt still for the first time in years. And I thought, maybe you were searching too." Sandra stood then, walked over to the fireplace, lit it with slow, practiced hands. The room warmed instantly, not just in temperature but in spirit. She turned back to him, the firelight dancing across her face. "I am searching, but I don't know where I'm going." He rose from his chair, walked to stand beside her, not touching, just near enough to share the silence. "Then let's be lost together. Just for a while." She didn't answer. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in her fear. They didn't sleep together. They didn't kiss. They didn't pretend the night would fix years of distance between who they were and who they pretended to be. But as Keanu fell asleep on her couch, wrapped in a blanket too short and memories too long, and Sandra watched him from the hallway with a tired heart that dared to feel again, something shifted. The storm outside had softened. And inside, in the quiet spaces between confession and comfort, something new had begun. Not love, not yet, but trust. And in a world that demanded perfection, that alone felt like a miracle. The world showed up. But she stayed. The sun rose slower that morning, or at least it felt that way. It painted soft golden lines across Sandra's wooden floor, filtering through the half-closed blinds like a quiet promise of calm. She stood in the doorway to her living room, barefoot, holding a warm mug in both hands as she looked at the man still asleep on her couch. Keanu, curled slightly, arms folded beneath his head, wrapped in the same blanket he had fallen asleep in hours ago. There was something impossibly peaceful about him. A man so known by the world yet so untouched by its noise. She didn't want to wake him. She didn't want the spell of this moment, this stillness, to end. And yet something in her heart stirred with equal parts ache and joy. He looked like someone who could leave at any moment, but hadn't. Not yet. Maybe not at all. She turned away, walking into the kitchen, lost in thoughts too heavy for morning light. But the sound of footsteps behind her was soft, deliberate. "I had a dream," Keanu said, his voice still dusted with sleep. "That I was standing in a house that didn't belong to me, and still felt like home." Sandra smiled without turning. "That's a very poetic way to say my couch hurts your back." He chuckled, a real laugh, warm and low, and that sound filled her chest in places she thought were permanently closed. They ate in silence. Scrambled eggs, toast, fruit she forgot she bought. It was nothing fancy, but it was real. Two people existing in the same space without the armor of celebrity or expectation. Just being. And for a while, that was enough. Until the world knocked. They decided, after breakfast, to take a drive. No destination. Just wheels on pavement and a sky that had cleared like someone had wiped it clean. Keanu drove. Sandra let her arm hang out the passenger window, wind rushing through her fingers like a reminder she was still here, still free. They drove north, through quiet hills and sleepy roadside towns, stopping for coffee at a nameless shack with peeling paint and the best blueberry muffins either of them had ever had. It felt like a movie, yes, but not the kind they'd acted in. The kind they'd longed for. Unscripted, undirected, real. But by noon, someone recognized them. It started with a waiter at a tiny outdoor cafe. A young man, probably barely 20, whose hands trembled as he held his phone, asking for a photo. Sandra said no gently. Keanu smiled apologetically, but the damage was done. By the time the check came, there were 4 people outside the restaurant. Then 6. Then more. Whispering, filming, taking photos behind sunglasses, pretending not to look directly. One woman loudly said, "Are they together?" Like, together. Another laughed. "God, I hope so. They'd be perfect." But to Sandra, it didn't feel perfect at all. It felt suffocating. Like something delicate was being yanked into the spotlight before it had a chance to grow roots. She didn't speak much on the ride back. Her arms folded tight across her chest. Keanu didn't push her. But when they pulled up to her house and she reached for the door handle without a word, he placed a hand gently over hers. "Don't run," he said softly. She paused, her knuckles white. "I'm not running." But they both knew she was. "Sandra," Keanu continued, "I know what this is. I know what this can become. The stories, the headlines, the speculation. But that's noise. It's not us." She looked at him, anger and fear rising like twin storms. "Easy for you to say," she snapped, instantly regretting it. "You're the guy the world calls humble no matter what you do. Me? I smile wrong in one photo and I'm cold. I date once and it's troubled actress finds love again. I can't breathe without someone rewriting my life." There was silence. Then Keanu did something she hadn't expected. He nodded, slowly. "You're right. You're absolutely right. But let me ask you something. Is their version of your life more important than your actual life?" Her eyes brimmed, not because he challenged her, but because he was the first man who didn't try to save her from herself. He just stood there, unwavering, letting her rage. Letting her be. She turned away, pacing now. "I've spent years curating this calm," she muttered. "I have my privacy, my rhythm, my silence. And it threatens all of that." Keanu stepped closer, not intimidating, just present. "Then let me threaten it with truth. Not promises, not fairy tales, just presence. I'll show up, every time. Even if you push me away, even if you slam the door, I'll still knock." She collapsed into a chair, head in her hands, breath shaking. "What if I mess it up?" she whispered. "What if I ruin it before it even begins?" Keanu knelt beside her, looked up into her tired eyes with a steadiness she hadn't seen in years. Then we rebuild, together, brick by honest brick. And there, in the fading light of a day that had nearly broken her, Sandra realized something that hit harder than any camera flash or cruel headline. He wasn't going anywhere. Not because he wanted to own her pain, but because he respected it. Respected her. Enough to walk beside her, not ahead. Not behind, beside. They sat there long after the sun dipped below the horizon, no longer strangers to the storm. And when she reached for his hand, fingers trembling, eyes still unsure, he didn't grip tightly. He didn't pull. He simply opened his hand and let hers rest there. Lightly, freely, no promises, no rush. Just presence. And in that fragile, quiet moment, she didn't run. She stood beside him. They didn't speak about what happened that day, not for a while. After the storm of cameras and the tension in her voice and the fear in her bones, Sandra needed time to sit with what was revealed. And Keanu, in his quiet patience, gave her that time. Days passed like slow-moving clouds. Not heavy, not bright, just honest. They exchanged a few texts, some small notes sent without expectation. A photo of a record shop. A quote from a book. A single, "You okay?" followed by, "Still here." It wasn't romantic in the way the world defined it, but it was steady, a rhythm that echoed the kind of love that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, doesn't play games, a love that simply waits. Then came the night of the film tribute. A foundation was honoring Sandra's 3 decades of work, not just in acting, but in charity, advocacy, quiet kindness. She almost didn't go. The idea of standing in front of cameras, facing the questions, the eyes, the pressure, it brought back everything she had fought so long to quiet. But something inside her whispered, "Don't hide anymore. Not from this. Not from him. Not from yourself." And so she said yes, she would go. Alone if needed. Strong if possible. Soft if she could manage it. She stood in front of her mirror hours before the event, staring at herself. Not the makeup, not the designer gown, not the flawless image. Just her. A woman who had survived grief, criticism, heartbreak, and loneliness, and still showed up. The gala was held at a grand hall downtown, cameras flashing like fireworks as cars pulled up one by one. When Sandra stepped out, there was a moment, just one, where everything seemed to hush. She wasn't trying to be breathtaking. She simply was, not because of the dress but because of the way she carried herself. Like someone who had nothing left to prove and everything still to give. Reporters leaned forward, flashes intensified, questions flew. "Sandra, over here. Who designed the gown? Any comment on the rumors about you and Keanu Reeves?" She almost walked past them. Almost kept her head down, smiled the practiced smile, but something in her refused. She turned, not with anger, not with drama, just calm, steady. "There's nothing to comment on," she said, her voice clear, "but there is something I want to say." The crowd quieted. Even the cynical press, the hardened photographers, paused. For years I lived in the spotlight, but I felt invisible. I performed strength. I delivered answers. I let the world write my story before I got the chance to tell it. But not tonight. Not anymore. She looked directly into a lens. Not to speak to the press, but to speak to every woman watching, every person who had ever hidden their truth to survive. If you're waiting for someone to save you, stop. You don't need saving. You need to be seen. And when you finally see yourself, the right people will too. She turned and walked inside. Not a dramatic exit. Not a mic drop. Just quiet power. Inside the hall, she was greeted with applause, hugs, speeches, praise. But none of it mattered. Not like the man standing at the back of the room, away from the spotlight, his eyes fixed on her like she was the only reason he came. Keanu didn't smile wide, didn't rush to embrace her. He simply nodded once, the way you do when someone does something brave. When someone finally chooses themselves, and she walked to him, past the crowd, past the flashing lights, past the world that once made her shrink, She stood in front of him, closer than before, her voice low. "I don't want to hide anymore." He met her gaze. "Then don't." She reached for his hand, not as a statement to the world, but as a truth to herself. And for the first time, there was no fear in her fingers. They sat together at a table near the back, not at the front with the VIPs, not in the center of attention, just together, laughing softly, stealing glances, sharing space like people who had learned to treasure silence more than applause. And when the evening ended, when the final toast was made and the crowd thinned, a reporter caught a photo, just one, of Keanu and Sandra walking out the door, hand in hand. No security, no glam, just two people, smiling and free. That photo would go viral. But for once, she didn't care, because for the first time in years, Sandra wasn't worried about the headlines. She wasn't afraid of the whispers, the rumors, or the interpretations. She had found something better than romance, something deeper than spectacle. She had found peace, and as she looked over at Keanu, the man who didn't rescue her, didn't fix her, didn't chase her, just waited for her to come home to herself, she realized the story didn't need an ending. It just needed to be lived.